Welcome to Casual Politics, Ken Clarke. Thank you very much for accepting my request, and
Pleasure.
I'm very grateful to you. You need absolutely no introduction, but I think, without any doubt, you are a political giant, and veteran, and the longest Conservative MP in Parliament. Why you didn't become Father of the House?
That's a very simple explanation. It's a story. Gerald Kaufman, who got in at the same election as me in 1970, is the father of the house. And if you get, there are four of us who came in 1970 and have continuous service ever since. And the father of the house is the one who got sworn in first, the one who got here first to get sworn in. And Gerald and I both remember that I was in the queue to be sworn in front of the Speaker, and Gerald tapped me on the shoulder and said, would I mind if he went in front of me as he had an important meeting? I didn't mind at all. So away went Gerald in front of me, and 45 years later, that makes him Father of the House. I'm very glad. It's an absurd title. I don't want to be Father of the House.
And how exciting was it to you to get re-elected and see your party as a majority government after 23 years?
Well, it was obviously very good. I was delighted, and like everybody else, surprised. Few people have tried to persuade me that they saw it coming. You can rationalise it looking back, and actually the key thing that gave us the majority was the small swing from Labour to Conservative in all the marginal seats in the Midlands, where elections are usually decided, and in the northwest a bit. The big events were in Scotland and in the southwest. But in fact, all the marginal seats with which I'm surrounded in my Nottinghamshire seat, most of which the Labour Party thought they were going to win, we kept, and indeed we won a marginal seat back at Derby North.
Was it because of your message that the Labour government will form a coalition with SNP?
I think the SNP played a large part, and I think that was quite legitimate, really. I mean, the only thing going for us otherwise was that Labour had left an economic mess, that the economy was doing quite well, and people were rather fearful of the risk of putting in a party that really didn't clearly know quite what to do to continue the economic recovery. And then the only new thing that happened during the campaign was this emergence of this extraordinary SNP rout in Scotland, although most people didn't quite see how big it would be. But electors were worried because the SNP was cheerily saying that any Labour government, they'd make their mind up week by week whether they were going to support them or not. So you were going to have a terribly weak Labour government, and that rather settled it. I don't think people were particularly warmed to the Conservatives because we've had to do some tough and difficult things, and I don't think the campaign of any of the parties made the faintest difference to the outcome. But in the end, people decided, better be safe than sorry, avoided the risk, and in my part of the world, where we had a normal election, there was a slight swing to the Conservatives.
Why did it take you 23 years to come back as the majority government?
We went in for a crazy civil war in opposition, and we were up against a brilliant campaigner in Tony Blair, who didn't have any great competition to deal with. Some of our leaders were all right, but they were spending their entire time engaged in bizarre, offbeat arguments inside the Conservative Party, mainly about this strange movement called Euroscepticism, which has gripped a lot of our backbenchers. So we were a slightly irrelevant opposition. The New Labour would not have lasted so long if we had come to terms with our defeat, and if we had decided how to get back to free market economics with a social conscience and concentrated on mainstream issues. But right-wing Conservatives and the right-wing Conservative press thought the whole thing was about bizarre theological arguments about Brussels.
And during that time in the wilderness, you ran 3 times to become leader of your party.
Yeah.
When you look back, why you were not as successful as other leaders to become leader?
Because I was pro-European, and because my views, as I've just given to you, are quite disdainful of some of the right-wing nationalist arguments that our right-wing produce.
Is it damaging to be a Europhile in the Conservative Party now?
Well, there is a big faction of very hardline Eurosceptics. They're not as big as the right-wing press appear to do. The Murdoch press, the Barclay Brothers press, who agree with them, make them celebrities and give the impression that that is the view of all conservative backbenchers. That does have an effect on voluntary members in the field. That has an effect on the sort of people who are selected as candidates. And obviously, although I wasn't badly defeated in my leadership campaigns, it made all the difference as far as I was concerned. In 1997, the parliamentary party had changed. The parliamentary party that had been there before 1997 would certainly, I think, have elected me leader. It was then only MPs who voted. But the newcomers who came in were all people who'd been selected with weird views about Maastricht, but some of whom have changed their minds since. But that was quite sufficient for them to look for someone other than me.
After that delightful shock to see your party as a majority government, after when all the pollsters and political commentators had predicted that we will see a coalition government after the general election, but it seems already that your party is split over Europe and Human Rights Act. What is that?
All parties, the British political parties, are broad coalitions. The traditional governing parties, because they're governing parties, one right of centre, the other left of centre, both contain an amazing range of views. The British Labour Party or the British Conservative Party would not be single parties in the rest of Europe, where you've got PR. They would have divided, and they're used to coalition government. The Labour Party and the Conservative Party are kind of pre-packed coalitions. But once you get on individual things, there's a wide range of views. And I say the Conservative Party is obsessed with Europe, and having decided to hold a referendum, that has merely fed the obsession. It's one of the things that made UKIP suddenly emerge, was the fact we were going to have a referendum suddenly made Euroscepticism seem a credible sort of thing. And until we get this referendum over, we're still going to be racked by arguments over Europe. And actually, referendums never settle anything, but it will go back to normality a bit, I hope, after the referendum. Other things, well, there is a range of views, and in all political systems, in all democracies, centre of gravity shifts a bit to the right, a bit to the left.
Are the bastards back in Conservative government?
Well, that's one stray remark. That's just a sort of trivial tabloid newspaper story, which reflected an extremely bitter argument. But the Bastards incident, just remind John Major's government, which was a highly successful government, we actually achieved economic success. We came out of recession. We had growth with low inflation. We had a lot of social reform. We carried on modernising the British economy. And on economic policy, when we went to the election in those days, we were miles ahead of the polls.
And the economy was growing.
Yes, and Blair and Brown dealt with that by just saying they weren't going to alter economic policy. But the actual, far too many members of the Conservative Party in the mid-1990s weren't interested in these mainstream things. They were causing public mayhem with arguments about the Maastricht Treaty. Now, looking back, this does seem to be quite crazy, because most Eurosceptics can't remember what was supposed to be wrong with the Maastricht Treaty. Most of the arguments that took up day after day in the House of Commons were off the wall. They weren't really related to anything that was in the treaty at all. But by 1997, I think the public were quite right. It was quite obvious that the Conservative Party could not form and maintain a stable cabinet. Now, it's taken us quite a long time to learn the lesson of that. It's not 23 years, it's 18, I think, isn't it? But we better have learnt it. But obviously, some of the old Maastricht veterans are still here, so I still have the same arguments when we debate it with old colleagues who are personal friends, some of them. Present a new version of what I'm afraid I regard as completely irrelevant arguments to a 21st century Britain, which has to learn to come to terms with and exercise its influence to protect its interests in the modern world.
So Bill Cash, one of the rebellion, is still in your party?
No, Bill and I have had this same debate for 30 years. And Bill brings Europe into his views on absolutely everything. And John Redwood is a lot of time for John Redwood. John Redwood and I do agree on economic policy, but John is fervently, passionately disagrees with my views on Europe. And I'm astonished to find that an argument that I thought was being resolved when I started in politics 50 years ago, because the first party conference I attended was then Harold Macmillan defended at a party conference his decision to apply for membership of what was then the European Community. And I never imagined that 50 years later, a slightly zanier version of this argument would still be going on.
And do you think that David Cameron is putting his foot into Harold Wilson's footsteps with his EU renegotiations?
In a way, yes. I mean, the reason to have a referendum is in order to manage the party, which was Harold's motive. Now, it has to be done more skillfully than Harold did it. It was Harold who introduced the whole idea of referendums into British politics in order to control the hopeless split inside his party. He was going to do a U-turn because on rather bogus grounds he'd opposed the legislation of the Heath government that had taken us into the European Community. Harold was a good enough economist to realise we had to stay in the European Community, so he wanted to sort of let the public decide and tell him, and tell the left wing of his party, who were then the major opponents of membership, that we should stay in. As a piece of party management, it failed. Harold split his party hopelessly. He hadn't expected his cabinet to campaign in the referendum. He thought you kind of waited for the public to give you an answer. And he was horrified when he saw them having a ferocious campaign against each other on both sides. And that really cemented the split. And the Labour Party did divide over Europe only 6 years later. The Jenkinsites and the Social Democrats, the pro-Europeans, split on the subject of Europe. Yes, and they left the Labour Party and stayed out. Their representatives are still in the Liberal Democrat Party. So Harold's attempt at party management meant that his party did not win an election for almost 30 years.
But is there a danger that the same split will happen to your party after the referendum?
Well, I think we're all aware of that. That even Bill Cash and John Redwood would agree with me that in having this debate yet again, we do have to make sure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the 1990s, that we don't actually irreversibly shatter our party on what most of the public regard as a second-order political issue.
And now on George Osborne's budget, some people they said that it was a regressive budget. Do you agree with them?
Well, I asked him in the Queen's Speech debate. I called for a bold and radical July budget, and that's what he was. And I think it was an excellent budget. I'm a strong supporter of George Osborne's economic policy. He's been remarkably successful over the last 4 years. In the old days, when we had two-party politics, we'd have had a walkover in the election because we'd had such a successful period of starting to get us out of the longest and deepest recession since the war, starting to modernise the economy, to give a modern, balanced economy. And I don't think this government will stay very popular for very long on individual issues, because it is necessary to have a strong government taking tough and difficult decisions for the sake of future generations, to give Britain a modern, competitive economy. If you've got to do tough and difficult things, you get on with it. Do them early in the Parliament. The economy is growing fairly strongly at the moment, strong enough to take another period of tackling the deficit. So once he announced the July budget, I expected, but I earnestly hoped, that he would produce the kind of budget he has. Everything now depends on whether it works, and people would judge it, not by these measures, which of course they'll have forgotten in 4 years' time, but by whether or not it produces a recovery in the economy.
The new national living wage, clamping down on non-dumps. Didn't you have the impression that Ed Balls was across the box and announcing his budget?
No. Well, I disapprove actually of politicians setting wage rates. And what we mustn't do is drift into a politics whereby the next election party political leaders who've no longer got any taxpayers' money to bribe the electorate with, which Gordon Brown used to do all the time, will now start ordering other people to bribe the electorate by competing how big your pay rise is going to be if you vote for one party or the other. I mean, it's obviously a political necessity to speed up the rise in real wages that we've seen, but we've got to take care with the living wage, which he announced to offset the short-term effects of cutting tax credits. But it's got to be done in such a way this doesn't open the door to 20 years of politics where different political parties compete with each other in ordering employers to raise wages. This one, the living wage, the compulsory living wage, the IFS says will cost 60,000 jobs. I hope they're right. I hope it's not more than that. And I hope it's the last time that a government just steps in to fix the minimum wage in this country. But when you look at the inevitable reaction to finally tackling this ridiculous tax credit system we've got in a serious way, it was necessary to do something to boost the incomes of the lower paid. So I accept he's done it, and I can see why he's done it, and it probably was politically necessary, but I'm not very keen. Non-doms, well, they're partly political, but Ed Balls sort of pretended that he could spend a lot of money and he was going to get it all for some mysterious foreign billionaires who were all living here and would happily pay tax on their worldwide income, so long as you took away their tax status, which was complete and utter nonsense. The average member of the public, the average MP, doesn't really understand what a non-dom is. And what George has done is he's tinkered with some of the rather odder anomalies of the 100-year-old rules about what a non-dom is. I don't think it'll actually make very much difference.
The big winners of this budget were the pensioners, as usual, and the big losers were the students, because the Chancellor announced that there will be a rise in tuition fees in line with inflation. And now students, when they leave university and they want to get on to and work, now they left with £50,000 of debt. Do you think is that fair to them?
I was converted to being in favour of tuition fees long ago. I opposed it when Tony Blair first announced it, but if you look at it now, no one who opposes tuition fees has any suggestion to make about how we pay for maintaining international standard universities. They just say we should have it free. Well, that's fine, but that is, there's probably a Greek politician or two who believes that as well. That's nonsense. And we have maintained the really world standard quality of our best universities by introducing a system whereby those people who have the good fortune and the privilege of going to university pay for it in part by a loan which they later repay. The idea, I was lucky, I was paid for, I had free education, higher education, I was paid for out of taxation, but when I went, less than 10% of the population went to university. You can't maintain that when more than half of the age group go to university. And anyway, why should a bus driver pay taxation for the education and training of a barrister or a surgeon or a hedge fund manager? It is absurd that the general population should be expected to provide free education and training for people who are going to be far more prosperous than they are. So I understand, if I was a student, I'd probably be against it. But it's unless and until somebody actually, instead of just protesting, comes up with an alternative way of maintaining our universities, I think it's a perfectly good system.
But don't you think that they should do the same and pay for students' tuition fees, because we are paying for pensioners part. So
because if you take advantage of your education, you and your contemporaries are going to be the prosperous, the rich, future middle class of this country. The pensioners can do nothing about their income. They've passed the stage, quite a lot of them, when they have any prospect of responding to changed economic circumstances, they do need sort of their living standards to be maintained. Now, you can argue about the extent to which pensioners have been very favourably treated by the government compared with any other section of the population. It may have been overdone a bit, I don't know. But the case for treating pensioners differently from that section of the population who are either in work or are going to be in good work quite soon is, I think, quite strong.
The Baby of the House made a very powerful maiden speech, Mary Black, and she said that food banks, they're not part of the welfare state. And this shows that the welfare state in this, the welfare system in this country is failing. Do you agree with her?
No, well, the welfare system in this country has become faintly ridiculous, with a huge proportion of the population given financial incentives to become dependent on other people, on other taxpayers, on the state. It costs you money if you tried to get off welfare and get into work. The cost of the welfare system was becoming ridiculous. It was made worse particularly by the tax credit system, which was just an electoral bribe. It was just a way of giving money to the 9 out of 10 families, telling them to vote Labour. And it used to be jacked up every time an election was coming. And most of them higher rate taxpayers, where people thought to be so wealthy they should pay the higher rate of tax, were having their tax taken out of one pocket by the government, and then being told they were so poor they needed a benefit to help them look after their children. So they were given a tax credit by a beaming Mr. Gordon Brown in the other pocket and told to vote Labour. The welfare system needs to be reformed, and even with the disabled, and obviously you must protect the vulnerable and disadvantaged, people who have no choice but to be look to the state for support. But the system had produced far too high a proportion of the population who had persuaded themselves that they were never going to work, that the state was going to keep providing for them, and when they ran out of money, they go to food banks, which have been opened in large numbers recently, because not all very good at managing their resources. Nobody need staff or go to a food bank in this country, but the poor people who've got into debt and can't manage their resources keep going there. Other people go to food banks. But of course we all regret food banks. It's a tragedy to see people actually going along to sort of take food in that way. But the idea this is a case for going back to just carrying on spending ludicrous sums of money in order to ensure that a large proportion of the population never have to work is unsustainable.
And now on SNP's retaliation over fox hunting, does that show that how slim your majority is in the House of Commons? And is that a warning?
Our majority is very slim. I keep saying to all my colleagues, let's celebrate the election win, but don't let the hubris run for too long, because 12 is probably not enough. We have to do tough and difficult things. We have to enact legislation, take measures which will not be popular with the public on more important subjects than fox hunting, on economic and business related subjects particularly. And you've just got to do what you think is in the national interest and will produce the right results in at least 4-5 years' time. Now, for that purpose, majority of 12 isn't very much. Now, fox hunting arouses great passions, and it obviously is in a way an important subject, but it's a second order issue, and it's just a reminder that things have changed with this great block of SNP members, and that the government's majority on more important things will prove to be quite precarious as we go on. So I'm glad to be doing this as my last parliament, because I've never seen a situation like this before, and I think it's desperately important that the government maintains its course and is able to carry on doing all those things which are necessary. Democracy doesn't always get things right. I mean, some people vote for ridiculous governments, as the Greeks have just shown. The public have rather fortunately put a very competent and good government in power, but it's it's going to have to fight. It's going to have to be pretty robust in order to get to
They needed to take their revenge of when the leader of the House, Chris Grayling, he put off the MPs' vote on English laws to until the autumn. So what's going on with the English votes with English laws?
Well, I don't think he put it off because of the SNP particularly. He probably put it off because what he produced was too complicated. Quite a lot of Tories didn't like it either, and it's no good rushing it through. It needs to be planned and thought out properly. We do need an answer to the West Lothian question. It's been obvious for 10 years, but you've got to get it right. You can't start putting in all kinds of complicated measures. You can't write a constitution on the back of an envelope. The Scottish nationalists, taking the opportunity to express their anger at having English votes law at all, because obviously they realise that when we do finally get sorted out how we're going to have English votes on English laws, their influence and their ability to threaten the government on political matters generally will be diminished.
And do you miss your Lib Dem colleagues because they wanted to compromise with the government as the third largest party, and now SNP they want to defeat your party?
Well, the coalition government was immensely successful. I mean, we deserved to win, say, a good majority. It should have been like 1983 and 1987 for Mrs. Thatcher. The Thatcher government had turned the economy around, and we got colossal majorities in 1983 and 1987 because the Labour Party then had been responsible for economic collapse and had no idea what they were going to do if they took over from our steady process of reform. The Liberals were unfortunate victims. We had some very good colleagues, and I enjoyed working with the Liberals, and we all got on very well. And I think people exaggerate the impact on the government of the Liberals going. All this about this being the first Tory-only budget. There probably were bits of it that Nick Clegg would have blocked, but the general direction of policy for this Conservative government on economic matters will remain the same as the policy of the coalition government. Indeed, one reason why the Liberals got wiped out in the election was they were perceived by the public as having followed a rather conservative agenda in the economic reforms we've done.
And you're the only minister, as much as we could remember, who served under 3 prime ministers. Four prime ministers.
I was in the Whip's office in 10
Oh yes, 4 prime ministers. I know that you're going to say that you enjoy working with 4 of them, but which one did you most work with?
Well, the best government, I mean, see where David goes, but so far, the best government that I've served in, and probably rivals Attlee, the most significant government since the war, was the Thatcher government. and I enjoyed it. I mean, I always say, I did enjoy it, but I enjoyed it. I always say, the great thing with the Thatcher government is you can enjoy it as long as you can stand the hassle. There were lots of political rows, it was wildly controversial, the public, the country was going through a great deal of economic and social upheaval. It was very radical reform. But yeah, that was, I look back on that and think, well, Margaret and her government, we really did something. We made a substantial difference. Britain was an economic laughingstock when she took over. We'd won a war and thought the world owed us a living. And Mrs. Thatcher brought us into the modern world. What David's got to do now is to change things here, change attitudes. We're in a globalised economy. We're in a dangerous, interdependent world where international crises affect all our interests. Got to get the British to come to terms with living in the 21st century, the world our children and grandchildren are going to inhabit. That means staying in the European Union, but it also means running a much more business-like and effective economic policy.
I'm very disappointed when Lady Thatcher moved you from health department.
She moved me to education. All Margaret ever did usually was promote me. I mean, I had tremendous rows with her. She didn't approve of my health reforms. She wasn't in favour of them when they started, and she tried to stop them at the end. I mean, she wanted reform. We couldn't carry on with the health service as it was. We both agreed on that. But she wanted to go to the American model, and I refused to do that. What the reason she reshuffled me, I was reminiscing with one of my old colleagues in education recently, Michael Fallon, who's now the Defence Minister. He was one of my junior ministers. She moved him there as well. And she thought I'd done quite enough at health in the sense it was now wildly controversial. She wanted to quieten it politically and just get on with implementing my reforms. Meanwhile, education, Ken Baker's reforms, had rather gone into the sand, and the department had succeeded in stopping it going any further. The department was some of the civil servants in the department were very hostile to our education reforms. So she wanted me to be moved from health, where it needed to go quieter, to go to education, where it needed to be livened up. So I introduced the regular testing, I introduced the publication of results, which the press turned into league tables, I introduced Ofsted, and they weren't my reforms there, they were Ken Baker's reforms. Ofsted was mine. It got Ken Baker's reforms, got reform and producing a modern education system underway again. So no, that was. Although at the time I argued, I did protest to her. Look, I want to stay until we implement it. And she said, "Oh, William can do that." But I enjoyed myself at education. I just didn't stay there long enough. About an hour and a year and a half, and then I suddenly found John Major then moved me to the Home Office.
And my last question, what will be Ken Clarke's role in the EU referendum's campaign, and will you lead the Yes campaign?
Well, I certainly obviously will be campaigning for a Yes vote. I do think it would be unbelievable if the British decide to switch off and go into sort of rather grand isolation at a time when we've never been more interdependent. And for our ability to influence events and our ability to earn our living, we need to develop further our role in the globalised economy, which is based on our access to the biggest organised market in the world, the European Union, which Margaret Thatcher did all that. It was a single market. That was the Thatcher policy. We wouldn't have a single market if it hadn't been for Margaret's insistence that the Europeans did that. So I will campaign. I actually think we need to find a platform for all the younger politicians from all parties who are very pro-European as me. They find it very difficult to get a platform. The right-wing press won't report them, and they won't report me. The pro-European views don't appear in what is called the conservative press because they don't agree with it. Their owners don't agree with it. So you've got to find some way of campaigning and try to create a platform and bring out some of the personalities of the next generation who are as pro-European as I am. So I'm certainly not going to lead it, but I will be there. I shall do my best. I feel very strongly about it.
And we shall wait and see. Well, thank you. It was a great pleasure. Anyway.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And you haven't kept a